Welcome back to the deep dive. Usually when we sit down to do one of these, we're looking at something manageable, a business case study, a new piece of consumer tech, maybe a specific historical event that's nicely contained in the past. But the stack of research we have on the desk today, it feels different.
It does. It's oppressive material, and honestly, it should be.
Yeah. It's physically heavy looking at these binders, but there's a density to it that's actually quite difficult to grapple with.
Yeah.
We're grappling with the Indian residential school system in Canada.
Right.
And I know what you, the listener, might be thinking right now. You know this. You've read the headlines. You know about the apologies. You know it was a tragedy.
But the source material we are analyzing today, specifically this comprehensive systems analysis titled The Architecture of Erasure, is asking us to stop right there.
Because it argues that if you view this merely as a tragedy or a sad historical mistake, you are actually missing the entire point.
Exactly. The tragedy narrative is a bit of a trap. It suggests that this was a well-intentioned educational project that just, went off the rails.
Right. You hear phrases like good intentions gone wrong or misguided assimilation.
You do. But the documents we have here, the financial ledgers, the theological treatises, the biological data, they paint a picture of a machine. A deliberate, high-functioning machine that did exactly what it was designed to do.
And that machine ran for a staggering amount of time. I mean, from 1831 with the Mohawk Institute all the way to 1996.
1996.
That date always floors me. That is not history books. That's living memory. I was in high school in 1996. The last federally run residential school closed while the Spice Girls were on the radio and we were using dial-up internet.
It is entirely contemporary history, and the scope is massive. But our mission today isn't just to recite a timeline of misery. We are going to do what the source material demands, which is a systems analysis.
So we need to look at the residential school system not as schools, but as a specific technology of colonization. We're going to pop the hood and look at the engine.
And to do that, we have to start with a concept from the sociologist Irving Goffman, which appears right on page 1 of the brief, the total institution.
The total institution, right.
Yeah.
Goffman is essential here.
He is. He defined a total institution as a place where a large number of like-situated individuals are cut off from the wider society for an appreciable period of time, leading an enclosed, formally administered round of life.
So think prisons, concentration camps, asylums.
Monasteries, too.
But the research points out a critical distinction here. A prison is designed for containment, keeping dangerous people in. An asylum is, theoretically anyway, for treatment. What was the residential school for?
The source uses the term ontological transformation.
Okay, that is a heavy phrase. Let's unpack that. Ontological transformation.
Well, ontology is the philosophical study of being, of existence itself. The goal of these schools wasn't just to teach a child to read or do arithmetic. It was to fundamentally alter the nature of the being inside the institution. The goal was to take a human being who was indigenous, culturally, spiritually, linguistically, and re-engineer them into something else entirely.
To overwrite their being.
Yes, to overwrite it completely.
It's social engineering on a massive scale.
Precisely. And the framework the source uses to explain this is fascinating. It treats the system like a computer or a piece of industrial hardware.
Okay, so breaking it down.
Right. We have the software, which is the theology and ideology, the hardware, which is the economic realities, and then the output, which is the biological and legal consequences.
It sounds cold to talk about human lives as software and hardware.
Yeah.
But when you read the administrative documents, you realize the system itself was that cold. It was highly calculated.
It was.
So let's boot up the software. What is the operating system that allows a government and a church to look at a child and say, we need to erase who you are?
At the kernel level, the absolute deepest code, we are looking at something called the Doctrine of Discovery.
Now, this has been in the news recently, specifically with the Vatican formally repudiating it in March 2023. But for centuries, this wasn't just an idea. It was international law.
It was the legal bedrock of the New World. It goes back to Papal Bulls from the 15th century, documents like Romanus Pontifex in 1455 and Inter Cetera in 1493.
So these were decrees from the Pope.
Decrees that essentially said if a Christian explorer encounters land that is not ruled by a Christian monarch, that land is terra nullius.
Terra nullius, nobody's land.
Legally empty, even if there are millions of people living there, thriving there, running complex societies. If they aren't Christian, they do not count.
So the theology effectively downgraded indigenous people to a status that was non-human or subhuman.
Exactly. They didn't hold title to the land because, according to the software, they didn't have the sole capacity to own property.
Wow. So this provided what the source calls moral immunity.
Yes, moral immunity. This is crucial for you, the listener, to understand. The people running this system, the bureaucrats, the priests, the Indian agents, they didn't see themselves as villains.
They saw themselves as saviors.
They did. If you truly believe the software, that these people are spiritually damned and legally non-existent without your intervention, then kidnapping becomes rescue.
And abuse becomes discipline.
Exactly. The Doctrine of Discovery turned atrocities into administrative necessities. The Vatican acknowledged recently that these documents were manipulated for political purposes, but the damage is that they provided this moral immunity for centuries.
And that brings us to the specific applications running on this OS. We have to talk about the churches, because about 60% of these schools were run by Catholics, specifically the Jesuits and the Oblates.
The Jesuit influence is profound here. There is a deep theological concept called redemptive suffering.
Okay, what is that exactly?
It's the idea that pain, when united with the passion of Christ, the suffering of Jesus on the cross, has a salvific power. It saves souls.
Now, in a monastery, amongst consenting adults, that might mean fasting or sleep deprivation or wearing a hair shirt. Self-denial to get closer to God.
Correct. But watch what happens when you upload that theology into a school for children who did not consent to be there.
It mutates.
It mutates severely. The Oblates and Jesuits valued martyrdom. They valued hardship. So when they looked at indigenous children, they didn't see hunger or physical punishment as a failure of care. They saw it as a spiritual tool.
So hitting a child wasn't just about keeping order in a classroom. It was about saving them.
To mortify the flesh was to release the soul. There's a famous, brutal quote attributed to Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, about killing the Indian in the child.
Right, everyone knows that quote.
But for the bureaucrats, that was a cultural metaphor. For the religious orders, it was often literal. You had to destroy the savage body to save the Christian soul.
There's a chilling detail in the notes about the Codex Historicus. These were the daily journals kept by the missionaries at the schools. And the analysis of these journals is just jarring.
It's a study in cognitive dissonance. If you read the Codex Historicus for a specific school, you will see entries about successful First Communions, beautiful choir practices, a great harvest.
It reads like a spiritual golden age.
It does, but researchers have cross-referenced these dates with survivor testimony and medical records. And we know that on those exact same days, there was rampant tuberculosis, physical beatings, and sexual predation.
But the priests didn't write that down.
They didn't just omit it, they sanitized it. The source describes how they created a magic circle where the abuse was a form of liturgy.
A magic circle?
Yeah. If I beat a child for speaking Cree, I am not an abuser. I am an exorcist driving out the devil of their culture. The theology acted as a shield against their own conscience.
Now, it wasn't just the Catholics. The Anglicans, Presbyterians, and the United Church ran the other 40% of the schools. And their software was a little different. The source calls it muscular Christianity.
Yes, this is very Victorian, very British. The idea was that moral rectitude comes from physical robustness, rigid discipline, and competitive sport.
This is where the obsession with hockey in residential schools comes from.
Exactly.
Hockey. It's the quintessential Canadian symbol. But in this context, it was a weapon.
It was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was an assimilation tool. If you play hockey, you are acting Canadian. But the source highlights a much darker utility.
Which was?
Sport was a paramilitary exercise. It was explicitly used to cure indigenous laziness, which was a racist stereotype completely baked into the system.
And it also worked as PR for the schools.
A huge PR tool. If the public sees a photo of a hockey team in crisp uniforms looking fit and competitive, they don't see the malnutrition in the general population of the school. It was a mask.
And for the students, the locker room was often just another venue for abuse away from the eyes of the public.
Exactly.
So that's the software, the theology and ideology. Now, you can have the most fanatical ideology in the world, but you cannot build a nationwide system of incarceration without money. We need to talk about the hardware, the economics.
And this is where the symbiosis comes in. The residential school system was essentially a public-private partnership.
The state and the church.
Yes. The state, the Canadian government, provided the hard power, the Indian Act, the laws, the police to catch runaways, and the funding. The church provided the soft power. The teachers, the management, the ideology.
But let's look at that funding. The per capita grant.
This is the economic engine of the disaster. The government paid the churches a fixed rate per child per year,
Like a tuition fee.
but a starvation-level tuition fee. The source gives us a comparison that is absolutely damning.
The numbers are wild.
They are. In the 1930s and 40s, the Canadian government was paying about 180 Canadian dollars per year per child. At the exact same time, similar boarding schools in the United States, which were by no means luxury institutions themselves, were receiving about $335 per student.
So the Canadian schools were operating on roughly half the budget of their American counterparts.
Half. And that $180 had to cover everything. Food, clothes, staff salaries, building maintenance, heating in a brutal Canadian winter. Everything.
So if you are a school administrator and you are massively underfunded, how do you keep the lights on?
You fall into what economists call a perverse incentive. To stay solvent, the schools absolutely had to be overcrowded.
Because more kids equals more money.
Exactly. The only way to get more money is to have more bodies. So administrators pack them in, knowing full well they lacked the space and the food.
They packed them in because they couldn't feed them otherwise.
Right. If the headcount dropped, the school went bankrupt. So the economic model practically guaranteed overcrowding. And overcrowding, combined with malnutrition, guaranteed disease. It was a death trap by design.
This leads perfectly into the half-day system, and I feel like this is the biggest misconception people have about these places. They imagine these kids sitting in a classroom from 9 to 3 learning the kings and queens of England.
Far from it. The source explicitly calls this child labor disguised as schooling. Because the grant was so incredibly low, the schools relied on the students to do the actual manual labor of running the institution.
The half-day system.
Yes, half the day in class, often with completely unqualified teachers, and half the day working.
And looking at the breakdown of the research, this work was strictly gendered.
Very strictly. The boys were essentially farmhands. And we aren't talking about a little vegetable garden up back. We are talking about industrial-scale farming, raising livestock, harvesting massive crops, maintaining the physical plant of the school.
And girls.
Domestic drudgery. The source describes girls as young as 8 or 9 peeling hundreds of pounds of potatoes a day, doing laundry for a school of 200 people, hand-scrubbing heavy, wet sheets, dealing with toxic lye soap, sewing uniforms for the whole school.
The government claimed this was vocational training.
That was the official line. But vocational training implies you are learning a marketable skill. Peeling potatoes for 6 hours a day isn't a trade. It's mere survival maintenance for the school.
Right. The government eventually admitted in internal memos that the churches were subsidizing the schools with cheap labor.
The students were paying for their own imprisonment with their bodies, and the ultimate tragedy is they left these schools with almost no real education. They were grade levels behind in reading and writing, and they hadn't actually learned a trade. They had just learned how to be repetitive laborers.
There is another aspect of the hardware that really stood out, which is the geography of dispossession. We usually assume schools were built simply where the people were, but the source suggests the locations were highly strategic for other economic reasons.
Yes, the location of the schools often correlated directly with industrial interests. Mining, timber, hydroelectric power.
Can you give us an example of how that worked?
Now look at the schools in northern Ontario or Quebec near the massive hydro projects, or St. Anne's in Fort Albany near resource-rich areas. When you take the children away and warehouse them in a school, you are breaking the transmission of land-based skills.
Right, you're storing the population.
You're storing them. If a generation of children is locked inside peeling potatoes, they aren't out on the land learning the trap lines, the migration routes, the specific, intricate geography of their territory.
So when the mining company or the hydro dam comes in to flood the area,
The land is practically empty. It becomes terra nullius again, not just in theology, but in reality, because the people who know how to occupy it are locked away. It facilitates industry.
there is one moment in the notes where the hardware gets hijacked, though. The Blue Quills School.
Yes, 1970. This is a massive turning point. The government wanted to close the Blue Quills School in Alberta to save government money.
But the Indigenous community pushed back.
They held a sit-in. They physically occupied the building. Now, not because they loved the residential school system, obviously, but because they wanted to seize the means of production.
They realized what would happen if it closed.
Right. They realized that if the school closed, their kids would just be scattered into the provincial white system, which was just another form of erasure. They wanted to take the hardware and install their own software.
It was the first time a residential school was turned over to Indigenous administration.
It was a powerful act of resistance. taking the machine and repurposing it to stop a closure meant to save Ottawa money.
That is a powerful image. But we have to go back to the darkest part of the system's operation, the point where the lack of funding and the absolute dehumanization collide. The source uses the term necropolitics.
Necropolitics. It's a concept from the theorist Achille Mbembe. It refers to the power of the state to dictate who lives and who dies, or who is kept in a state of living death.
And nothing exemplifies this more than the nutritional experiments. I have to be honest, reading the Mosby Revelations section of the source, it made me physically ill.
It's deeply disturbing. Ian Mosby is the historian who uncovered this. Between 1942 and 1952, the Canadian government realized the children in the schools were severely malnourished.
So the logical human response would be to feed them.
That is what you would think. But that's not what they did. They saw the malnutrition as a scientific opportunity. They used the schools as a living laboratory. They set up control groups and experimental groups.
Wait, let's be very clear about what a control group means in a hunger experiment.
It means you deliberately keep one group of children on the starvation diet. That's your baseline. So you can compare them to the experimental group, the ones you give supplements to. You actually need the control group children to stay hungry to prove that your vitamins work.
They kept kids hungry on purpose, to see what the minimum cost was to keep them alive and working.
That was the goal. Cost efficiency. They were testing things like Newfoundland flour, which was fortified, or giving riboflavin supplements. But they did this with zero consent from the parents or the children. And remember the dates, 1942 to 1952.
The Nuremberg Code was being written at that exact same time.
Exactly. While the entire world was condemning Nazi medical experiments and establishing medical ethics, the Canadian government was conducting controlled malnutrition experiments on Indigenous children. They chose to study the malnutrition they had created rather than fix it.
That is the definition of necropolitics.
The subjects were entirely expendable.
And we have to talk about the systemic abuse and the physical machinery of punishment. Specifically, St. Anne's Residential School in Fort Albany. There is a detail here that sounds like a horror movie, but it is right there in the police records. The electric chair.
It is thoroughly documented. At St. Anne's, there was a homemade electric chair.
Homemade?
Yes, constructed by the staff. It was used for punishment and, disturbingly, for sport. Survivors have testified to being strapped into this chair and shocked in a school run by a religious order.
It's just unfathomable.
It brings us back to the total institution concept. Inside those walls, moral norms were suspended. The outside world's laws simply did not apply.
But where were the police? Where was the RCMP in all this?
The RCMP acted as the enforcement arm of the system. Their primary job, in this specific context, wasn't to protect the children from abusive priests. It was to hunt down the runaways.
Right.
If a child escaped the electric chair and made it home, the RCMP would come to the door, arrest the child, and return them to the abuser.
And often punish the parents for harboring a truant.
Correct. There was a massive shield of silence. Police records were often purged, or crimes were simply not investigated. There was widespread shuffling of abusive priests, similar to the global Catholic scandal we know about today. The state protected its investment.
And the sheer volume of claims is staggering. The notes mention over 38,000 serious abuse cases resolved.
Just an astronomical level of predation.
This leads us to the ultimate statistic of this machine, the mortality rate. The unmarked graves.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has confirmed roughly 3,200 deaths. But everyone, historians, survivors, experts, agrees the real number is much, much higher. Estimates put it at 6,000 plus.
What was killing them?
Tuberculosis was the primary executioner, TB. But remember the hardware section we just discussed? TB thrives in overcrowded, malnourished populations.
The economic model created the TB epidemic.
Exactly. It wasn't an accident. It was a feature of the funding model. And when they died...
They were often buried in unmarked graves.
Yes. We've all seen the news from Kamloops, the 215 anomalies, from Maryeville, the 751, ground-penetrating radar finding hundreds of unknown burials.
Why didn't they send the bodies home to their families?
Because it all comes back to the ledger. It was cheaper to dig a hole behind the school than to pay the freight to ship a body back to a remote community. And in many cases, they utterly failed to even record the names of the dead.
That is the ultimate erasure. You take the child, you change their name to a number, you work them to death, and then you bury them without a marker.
Yes.
It is really hard to process. But the source asks us to pivot now, to look at this not just as a historical or economic event, but as biology. Section 4 of the outline is called The Body Keeps the Score.
This is where the science gets really fascinating and profoundly tragic. We are shifting to hard science here. We are talking about epigenetics.
Okay, for the listener who didn't major in biology, what exactly is epigenetics?
So imagine your DNA is a giant piano keyboard. You have millions of keys. You cannot change the keys. That is your underlying genetic code. You're born with it.
Okay, the keys are set?
But you can change the sheet music. You can change which keys are played, which are kept silent, and which are slammed down hard. Epigenetics is the sheet music. It's a chemical layer sitting on top of the DNA that tells your genes when to switch on or off, like a dimmer switch.
And trauma can change that sheet music.
Yes, profoundly. The source focuses on specific genes like NR3C1 and FKBP5. These are the genes that regulate your stress response. Specifically, how your body handles cortisol.
The stress hormone.
Right. When a child is subjected to severe chronic trauma, fear, hunger, abuse, isolation, the body attempts to adapt. It places a chemical marker called a methyl group directly onto these genes.
So what does that marker do?
It's like putting a piece of thick duct tape over a piano key so it doesn't play properly. It blocks the gene from being read.
So the stress response just gets broken.
It gets permanently dysregulated. The survivor's body gets stuck in a state of fight or flight. Even decades after leaving the school, even if they are completely safe in their own home, their biology is reacting as if they are still facing the abuser.
And here's where the research gets really terrifying. This doesn't stop with the survivor.
No. This is the concept of intergenerational transmission. We used to think this transmission of trauma was purely behavioral. Like if a parent is traumatized, they might be emotionally distant, and that environment affects the child. But the science now shows it is deeply biological.
The damage is actually passed down.
Evidence suggests these epigenetic tags that duct tape on the keys can be heritable. The second generation, the children of survivors, show higher allostatic load,
Which is wear and tear on the body.
Exactly. They have higher baseline anxiety, higher metabolic issues. Even if they never set foot in a residential school themselves, they inherited the sheet music of survival.
The source mentioned some very recent studies from 2024 and 2025 using something called Grimmage clocks.
Grimmage is a biological clock. It analyzes your DNA methylation patterns to tell you your biological age versus your chronological age. The studies show that Indigenous youth with high adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are biologically aging faster than their peers.
That is just a profound statement. Colonialism isn't just a political structure or a historical era. It is a biological agent.
It is literally shortening life at the cellular level. The source argues that the crime is still happening inside the cells of the descendants right now.
And what about the thrifty phenotype hypothesis mentioned in the brief?
This relates directly back to the starvation experiments and the underfunding. When you
Yeah.
starve a growing child, their metabolism adapts to hoard every single calorie it can get. It slows way down. It stores fat aggressively to survive the famine.
Right.
If that child survives and later in life has access to a normal, modern diet, their body is still chemically programmed for famine. This contributes directly to the disproportionately high rates of modern diabetes and obesity in Indigenous communities today.
So it's not a lifestyle choice.
It's biological programming from state-sponsored starvation.
So we've looked at the theology, the economics, the biology.
Yeah.
Now we need to look at the legal prism. Because according to the source, there was a very specific, calculated legal reason to destroy the culture. Section 5 brings up epistemicide.
Epistemicide is the intentional destruction of a knowledge system.
Why forbid the language? Why punish a 6-year-old for speaking Cree or Ojibwe? It wasn't just casual cruelty, it was strategic.
It's about the land. In the Western legal system, we prove ownership of land with a piece of paper. A deed, a title registered in an office. In Indigenous cultures, specifically in the Canadian context, land title is recorded in oral history.
The Adok or the Kungaks.
Yes. These are incredibly complex, highly accurate oral records of who owns what territory, the boundaries, the resources, passed down precisely through generations.
So if you break the language...
You destroy the title deed. If the grandchild cannot understand the grandmother, the chain of evidence is broken, the oral history dies, and if the oral history dies, the land becomes, once again, terra nullius in the eyes of the British or Canadian courts, because there is no legal proof of ownership.
It was literally a way to clear the title. Legal terra nullius.
Exactly. Until 1997.
What happened in 1997?
The Delgamuco Supreme Court ruling. This is a massive pivot in Canadian law. The Supreme Court admitted oral history as evidence on par with written documents for establishing land title.
That must have sent a shockwave through the system.
It exposed the entire colonial strategy. The state realized that despite the century of schools, despite the epistemicide, the oral history had survived. And now, suddenly, that history had massive legal power.
So the source argues that this ruling retrospectively exposes why the schools were so necessary for the state: to erase the evidence of ownership.
Precisely. They were the only way to prevent Delgamuku from happening. They tried to burn the evidence by killing the language, but the evidence survived in the people.
Now, before we wrap up, we really need to zoom out, because Canada wasn't doing this in a vacuum. Was this happening elsewhere?
Absolutely. This was a global colonial strategy. The mindset was international. Look at Australia.
The stolen generations.
Very similar biology and assimilation goals. They had slightly different methods, relying more heavily on foster care and state institutions rather than the specific residential school model, but the goal was the same: breed out the color and assimilate the culture.
And Scandinavia. The brief mentions Greenland, and I don't think people usually associate Scandinavia with this kind of thing.
No, they don't, but they should. The Sami people in Norway, Sweden, and Finland faced Norwegianization, residential schools specifically designed to kill the Sami language and culture.
And the Danish experiment in Greenland.
That's a heartbreaking one. In 1951, Denmark took 22 Inuit children from Greenland and moved them to Denmark. The stated idea was to turn them into little Danes, model citizens who would go back and modernize Greenland.
They were completely cut off from their families.
Cut off from their families, their language, their identity. It was a microcosm of the Canadian system, and almost all of those children suffered severe psychological trauma and marginalization later in life.
It really shows that this wasn't just a Canadian problem. It was a Western problem. A mindset that said, we are superior and we have the right to take your children to prove it.
And the truly scary part is, the source argues it hasn't stopped. It has just mutated.
Which brings us to the Millennium Scoop.
We talk about the IRS system ending in 1996, but then we had the 60s scoop, where child welfare agencies just started taking kids and putting them in white foster homes. And today, the system has simply shifted venues.
What are the numbers today?
There are more Indigenous children in state care right now, today, in the foster system than there were at the height of the residential school system.
Let that sink in for a moment. There are more kids being taken away from their families now than back then.
And the justification used by the state is usually neglect. But if you look closely, the neglect is almost always just poverty. And the poverty is a direct, measurable result of the trauma and economic dispossession caused by the residential schools.
It's a closed loop. The school breaks the family and destroys the local economy. The family inevitably struggles. The state comes in and says, you're struggling, so we're taking the kids.
And the cycle of fracture continues. The family unit is broken again. The source calls this the Millennium Scoop. It's the exact same machine, just with different branding. It's no longer the church doing it. It's the child welfare system.
So as we reach the end of this deep dive, we have to synthesize all of this. The outline promises a heterodox synthesis. What is the big takeaway here?
The primary takeaway is that we absolutely must reject the bad apple theory. This was not a few rogue priests or bad teachers. This was a tripartite system. 3 solid pillars.
Let's run through those 3 pillars. Pillar 1.
Weaponized schooling. The biological and psychological deterioration of the child was an acceptable, calculated outcome of the design.
Pillar 2.
Corporate partnership. The church and state were in a business partnership. The church provided the moral cover and the cheap labor. The state provided the legal hammer and the funding, all to access and clear the land.
And pillar 3.
Biological legacy. The crime isn't locked in the past. It is currently replicating in the DNA methylation of the descendants today.
Which means an apology, while necessary, doesn't actually fix it.
No, you can't apologize to a gene. You can't write a government check to fix a methylated promoter region on a strand of DNA. True justice, according to this system's analysis, requires biomedical support. It requires restoring the land and the language, the very things the system tried to destroy, because those are the things that actually provide resilience and healing.
It's a heavy realization. But there's a glimmer of hope in the ultimate failure of the system.
There is. The total institution failed in its ultimate goal. It wanted to turn Indigenous people into white Canadians, to erase them completely. It didn't work.
The identity survived.
The identity survived. The oral history has survived against all odds. Delgamuku happened. The land is actively being reclaimed. The machine broke down before it could finish the job.
Here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on. Something the source hints at but leaves for us to ponder. We talk about the hidden systems of the past. These schools were hidden in plain sight. Everyone knew they were there, but nobody from the outside truly looked inside.
Right.
So what are the total institutions of today that we are ignoring? What systems are we funding right now that 50 years from now, people will look back on and say, how did they not see the erasure happening?
That is the uncomfortable question, because the architecture of erasure never really disappears, does it? It just renovates.
On that note, thank you for listening. This was a tough one, but a deeply important one.
Indeed, knowledge of the system is the first step to breaking the cycle.
We'll see you on the next deep dive. Take care of yourselves.